Hello and welcome to Theatre and Diverse Narratives, a panel discussion brought to you by TheatreMaker.ie as part of Dublin Arts and Human Rights Festival. We're delighted to have you join us this evening. My name is Thomas Conway and I'll be moderating this evening's discussion. I work at the Lear Academy as a course leader on contemporary theatre. I also work as a dramaturg in the Irish theatre scene. Right then, before I introduce our panelists, I'd like to invite all of you watching on Facebook, Twitter or YouTube to join the conversation by participating in the chat. Yes, you will be able to forward questions and those questions will be viewed by a member of my team and we'll bring those questions to the panel. We'll be taking a short break for about 5 minutes after our discussion, which will be about an hour long. And at that point, we invite you to send in your questions. Now, I'd like for each of the panelists to introduce themselves. We will start with Pamela McQueen. Thank you.
And I'm a dramaturg who focuses on new plays and developing new work with solo authored plays usually. And thanks very much for the invite for being here to Smashing Times and to Mary, because I think it's a very important topic that I'm looking forward to discussing with you all tonight. So just a little background on me is that I qualified about 10 years ago now. I qualified with a Master's in Dramaturgy over in the UK and then was Associate Dramaturg with the Tron for 4 years and would have started working with diversity and inclusion there firstly. And then when I moved back to Ireland, as well as working with various theatre companies at the Abbey, at Druid, and being resident with the New Theatre for a couple of years as well, I've also done a series of mentorship with playwrights where we develop their skill set, but also develop the type of narratives that they want to focus on and directions they want to go in their theatre making. So I think tonight I'll probably be talking a little bit about that, around that question of mentorship and what's it for and how does it work, and also a little bit around programming and audiences.
Thank you, Pamela. Lovely to hear all that. Next, I'd invite Mary Moynihan to introduce herself as well. Thank you, Mary.
Thank you. Good evening, everybody. My name is Mary Moynihan, and I'm a writer, theatre and filmmaker and artistic director of the Smashing Times International Centre for the Arts and Equality. And I'm co-curator of the Dublin Arts and Human Rights Festival. So this is our second year to run the festival, and we reimagined the festival to happen online because of the pandemic, and we're delighted to run the festival with a number of partners. So there's Frontline Defenders, Amnesty International, Fighting Words, the Irish Council for Civil Liberties, the National Women's Council of Ireland and Procra, and we have a number of arts partners as well. So we have the Mill Theatre in Dundrum, John Scott Dance, Poetry Ireland, TheatreMaker.ie, that Theatre in Serbia, and working with a number of different artists and arts organisations and human rights organisations. And really the idea is to try and create a space to bring everybody together and to share ideas and to look at the role of using the arts to promote human rights. But also as well for us really to celebrate the idea of what human rights are and to celebrate the connection between the arts and human rights.
Terrific. Thank you, Mary. Lovely to hear that. Next, I will invite Lorraine Maher to introduce herself and her work. Thank you, Lorraine.
Thank you. Thank you, Thomas. As you said, my name is Lorraine Mark. I'm originally from Ireland. I'm Carrick-on-Suir in County Tipperary. Currently living and working in London. I work across London and Ireland. I'm current artist in residence at Access in Ballymont, looking at othering in contemporary arts and culture. And in my day job in London, I work for Clean Break Theatre Company, working in arts and criminal justice.
No, terrific. Thank you, Lorraine. Lovely to hear that. And Selina, may I invite you to introduce yourself, please?
Good evening. Great to be here. My name is Selina Cartmell. I'm the director of the Gate Theatre, 92-year-old institution that sits at the top of O'Connell Street. I've been there as director since 2017, and I launched 3 programs entitled one, The Outsider, the second was Love and Courage, and the third was Power and Freedom. one of the key missions that I was hoping and still on the journey to achieving was to make the Gate a beacon of social and cultural change. And I think now more than ever is a chance to really get to that place, for sure.
Great. That's a lovely point or a thought to look to return to. And indeed, the possibilities of taking on changes during this time, in which changes are taking place in any case. Finally, may I ask Dijana Milosevic to introduce yourself as well? And thank you for joining us, Dijana. Good evening.
And we are working in the realm of the engaged theater, working with topics that relate to the art and to society. And also, we are just about to open the Festival Arts and Human Rights here in Belgrade on Friday with a program that will be a combination of live events and online events. So I would also like to touch the base about that.
Terrific. So, and Dijana, you're joining us from Belgrade this evening.
Exactly.
Excellent. Very good. Now, when we were reviewing the topics this discussion could take on, I sort of hit on 6 to start with, and we just review those in the beginning, and I'd love to hear from the panelists which topics they feel strongest about and where they feel that they have the most authority to speak. So we looked at the idea of the responsibility of funders and indeed of applicants. And I suspect everybody here has known what it is to apply for funding, if not to allocate that funding at some point. So we'll get to that. So discussions around money tend to dominate, so hopefully we won't dwell there. I'm also keen to look at this notion of training theatre artists or bringing theatre artists through. So looking at from the other end of the scale and what responsibilities each of you might experience around that, and how we bring in strategies of diversifying in that regard when it comes to finding the students to train, and indeed when it comes to casting for the productions that we're in charge of, and many other areas. Likewise, looking at more widely at the duties, the responsibilities, and indeed the powers that cohere around artistic directors. We have 3 artistic directors here this evening, and I'm sure, and indeed Lorraine may even act as an artistic director on occasion, and Pamela works very closely with many artistic directors in her job. So, so looking at the kinds of responsibilities that devolve to artistic directors. If I may say this, Selina, we might even start there. Many years ago, we did a workshop with a man called Laszlo Martin. It was a week-long infuriation, I think, given the particular style that with which he approached directing. But I have a very vivid memory of you emphasizing how much the word responsibility was important to you, how it was the key word that you would use to navigate your career. Has that changed now that you are the artistic director of one of the key institutions in our city? How do you feel about this notion of a responsibility in the artistic directing, the role of the artistic director itself?
Yeah, well, I mean, you've got a better memory than I have there, Thomas, but it's a huge responsibility. It's a huge, I mean, I think on every level. I mean, I feel very much in our little pre-chat before we went live, I felt very much an outsider taking on the position of the Gate role. I named the first season The Outsider because I felt at the time it was really necessary to bring in voices and artists and stories that may have never had a chance to be on the Gate stage. So I think that was a key driver for me when I first went in was, okay, how can we really try and open in a in now looking back in a small way, and maybe if I'd been more braver or more courageous or more risk-taking at the time, I would have really gone much further with it, that I feel now, given everything that's happened, feels much more in my grasp to try and maybe do a bit more of that. But across everything, responsible for the staff, for the history, for creating opportunities for new audiences and new artists to make work. And I think something that I'm really revved up about now and inspired by, given what we face. And I don't want to move too quickly onto that big COVID question of thinking big, but I think it's a real opportunity for the Gate to really reimagine and reposition itself, and really move in potentially in a very different direction to what it has been, which has been a full-time producing house, dependent on 80+% audiences in order to try and make the thing work, make the business model work. So I think that's a really interesting place, given the fact that there's absolutely no guarantee of that coming in the near future in terms of live. And I think it really asks us, and I think asks what these institutions and these buildings and what the purposes are, the purpose is for these institutions now, and our role and the role that we can play in society, and how we can sort of bridge and build and rebuild and build back our relationship with communities, which the Gate was only really dipping its toe into.
Okay, and we'll come back to that notion of relationship with communities. I will ask first Dijana and then Mary maybe to talk on this point. Dijana, artistic leadership, artistic directing is a leadership role, and indeed it falls to you to determine the ethos of the company in large measure, and to decide a great deal of the where you think those companies should direct its energies. Your company works mostly with devised forms insofar as when it creates work, but it also works in curating festivals, as you've just mentioned, and so on and so forth. Could you give us an idea of the kinds of values that inform your work and the challenges you find in insisting on those values, and that they be, in a way, honored at every level of what you do?
Yes, thank you. My voice is back.
Well done.
Yes, no, it was like in the times of COVID, I'm really scaring people because I'm going around coughing, but basically this is really very nasty allergy that I'm fighting right now. For me, being the artistic director, or in a way like in this kind of the leading position, is really connected directly with responsibility. And responsibility is in the core of who we are as DACH Theatre and DACH Theatre Research Center, because when we started 29 years ago, for us, we very soon realized, because we started in a very challenging time during the Civil War and so on, at the start of Civil War. So we basically realized immediately that ask that question, what is our responsibility of artists and human beings, while people around us suffer so terribly. And then very connected with that came the idea, the notion that we are very privileged because we have and had the power of the public voice. And because of that we should really somehow try to connect what we do with the needs of our polis, of our community, and also with our own needs or our own wounds. So very often I speak that we work from the wound, from the place that is somehow painful, and this is what we are trying to transform and heal for ourselves and for the community. So this is one of the things that is like in our essence. And then about leadership, it's very interesting because, of course, through 29 years, we changed a lot. And from this kind of the very hierarchically driven like structure, where I was as the theater director and the leader, like on the top, let's say, now we changed a lot, and we are really like a team. And I really like this situation. And someone compared it as the flock of birds, that we are flying together and that we need to adjust to each other's all the time. And this is in fact what is happening right now. I mean, this festival that we are opening very soon is run by a team of about 10 women and maybe like 4 men. And I can say that this is a big part of pleasure to organize it, is about really sharing the passion and being and flying together. And just to add, related to it's very interesting. I was speaking in this morning's panel that Smashing Times and us are also both organizing and producing this festival. And we were very much inspired by Smashing Times last year. And it is interesting how our very different countries in very different situations, in very different parts of the world, in fact, are having very similar needs. And the need is, how do we connect through arts and human rights, and what does it mean, and can we make our, simply speaking, our communities a better place?
Very good. I will come to Mary, but I do want to just ask you further. Forming a theatre company in the midst of an ethnic conflict, does that foreground the needs to align with principles of diversity from the very beginning? You have to, openly say we need to recruit, we need to make connections with people who may seem to be on the other side of the conflict, for instance. Did you find
Absolutely.
that?
Yeah.
And so
for us,
so please go ahead. Maybe you could elaborate on that, please.
Yes, of course. That's a great question. For us, it was essential to connect immediately with people on the other side of conflict or with the other. Because we were in the very kind of the challenging situation. We were coming from the country, from the state that initiated the war. So we were one that was basically like a perpetrator. I mean, in our names, the atrocities were happening. So we had immediately to address that fact, which of course positioned us immediately in relation to our institutions and so on, that we were absolutely not funded until the beginning of 2000s. But that was fine. And also we really reached out to the other people in our region, to the people who really suffered, who were on the other side of the conflict. And not only that, I mean, it's we grew up in the very multicultural, multi-confessional society. Yugoslavia, that was my country before the Civil War, was a country that had 3 confessions, people from all around the world, literally, that created our life and the culture. And so suddenly, because of the Civil War, the main narrative became very nationalistic and xenophobic. And this is what we started to do from the very beginning, really like bringing back this as something, as a big value of our society, as something that we should celebrate, our diversity, all kinds of diversities. And this is how, I mean, it is today as well.
That's lovely to hear. It's lovely to hear Smashing Times proved to be so inspiring to a company who was based in Belgrade. Mary, I'm sure you must be pleased to hear that, and indeed to hear the connections between the 2 constituencies. Again, with your company, you seem to work with social content and with communities quite a lot, so that you're at perhaps the other side of the spectrum to where the gate is placed, perhaps. Could you give us a little bit of an idea of how it is you work with communities and how you express your responsibility towards them, and who it is works with you in that sense? Yeah.
Well, we've been very inspired by Dijana and Theatre as well, so it is really great to have the links in Ireland and across Europe. And actually, just to say a little about Smashing Times, we set up in 1991, and originally we were a purely professional theatre company, because we came out of the Focus Theatre in Dublin, which was Deirdre O'Connell, an amazing woman who ran the focus, and Stanislavski trained, and her idea of the Stanislavski system from what she called the Eastern version as opposed to the American version of it. But there was a group of us at the time. We were very conscious, firstly, that a lot of the plays we were performing in were written by men, and we were very conscious as well of a lack of roles for women in 1991. So really, that's where the idea first came from. As professional artists, we wanted to look at how we could take the work of playwrights, women playwrights, and produce their work. And then I think we did have a social conscience back then, because we were all kind of interested as well in taking theatre outside of the traditional theatre space. I just thought theatre was a powerful medium on so many levels. And I felt back then it was very elitist, and there was elitism then, where, you know, certain sectors of society didn't have access to the arts. And I wanted to share it, basically. And I remember we'd get on a bus, take the plays out to Ballymun, Tala, Coolock, all the places. I'm from Coolock originally. And we would put on these performances with very little resources, have full houses, great reaction. And we started to talk to the audiences afterwards. And those talks became so animated, we started to design workshops. And that's where the whole workshop aspect came. So then we started working with the community. So rather than us going out and performing for, we wanted to make theatre with the communities. And then we started to train communities to make their own theatre, and, you know, to have that access and collaboration. And then over the years, we from an early stage in 1991, we worked in Northern Ireland before the ceasefires. And that's always been very, I suppose, close to myself because of family connections to do with the Troubles in Northern Ireland. And I think in a way, that's where really we learned a lot of our skills around using the arts for human rights, because we were working in what was basically a conflict society. And the idea of using the arts then, like Dijana is talking about, to try and bring different communities together and create a platform to have the difficult conversations. And then as well, the idea of how you engage with the other. And for me, theatre is all about, you know, we volunteer to go to the theatre to hear someone else's story, to be in someone else's shoes. And how can we expand on that and develop this idea of the other? And I would say too that I remember initially in the early stages, somebody said to us, define who you are and what you do as an organisation. And we found that very hard to do because of the diverse nature of our work. And what we ended up doing was defining the ethos of the work, as opposed to defining what it is exactly who you are. What is the ethos? And that became really important, the idea of the ethos. You know, things like experimentation, risk-taking, being creative, but also the idea of, we were feminists, but we felt we have to have men involved. Really, you don't have to be, I am a feminist, but the idea of opening up conversations around that, because what we wanted was maybe in our naive way to change the world, but to look at the idea of just making the world a better place. And how do you do that through your art? And the work then evolved from that. We often respond to the communities we work with. And I think Augusto Boal from Theatre of the Oppressed, you know, I found it interesting when he said it, that you don't suddenly sit down and think, oh, I'm going to do this next. You're creating your work based on what's happening around you, with the people you work with and the communities you're working with. What resonates with us as artists, but also what's coming from the communities we work with. And I suppose on responsibility, your artistic process always has to be central if you're looking at issues, always central. And the issue, if you like, doesn't impinge on that. But I think as an artist, if you are looking at issues, you have a huge responsibility in terms of the structure you put in around that, because there is a responsibility there that's important.
Terrific. I'm going to come to Lorraine Mark next. Hello, Lorraine, and Pamela, I'll be coming to you immediately afterwards. But just to ask you, Lorraine, you grew up as a biracial person in an Ireland that was quite homogenous, and I wonder how you begun to take on those initiatives to start to look for access to people with whom you identified and whom you understood as being excluded on let's say, ethnic grounds or indeed racial grounds. And I can imagine that when you really had no template to work with, and that it often may have led to an opportunity or a sense of a boundless opportunity in some ways for what you're doing, and that the accent was very much on the imagination for you. Maybe you might give us a flavour of the kinds of initiatives you took on behalf of members of our community that were very much experiencing forces of exclusion, let's say.
Thank you, Thomas. I must say at the top of this session, I wasn't able to hear properly, so I wasn't even really sure what you're asking, but I must.
Right.
So apologies for that. All sorted now. So so I lead an organisation, IAmIrish, and I call it a movement actually rather than anything else. And I really resonate with some of the things that Mary has said. But I call IAmIrish a movement because that can be led by anybody at any time. And I think there's an overall responsibility from all of us as makers to be able to tell the stories of the communities that are around us. In our little pre-chat tonight, I was like, well, I feel a bit of an imposter in this space because I've never felt like Irish arts was a space for me, although I've worked in the arts in London for over 30 years. You know, I was considering myself a theatre maker, but I'm really kind of questioning what that even means anymore. And I think that's, you know, going back to what Selina was saying about COVID and the new opportunities and the challenges is really making me think about that. But over the last 30 years, I've made work in professional spaces that also works with communities. And we see these narratives often about, you know, what's excellence in the art. It's interesting again to hear Mary say, you know, that it used to be elitist, because I still find the arts very elitist, particularly when we're looking at arts in Ireland. It is very elitist. And that brings me back to one of the things that you said in the beginning about who are we teaching, who we're training, and thinking about the routes into the arts. And when there's very specific routes, we're always going to be missing out on some members of our community. So I guess that the work with IAmIrish wanted to reach all of those audiences and to be able to tell a story initially about a very specific group of people, taken from my own personal lived experience of being someone who is biracial and Irish, and realizing that when I looked at the arts in a more broader sense in Ireland, there isn't real representation. And I think, you know, we touched on this very briefly pre our talk tonight. Even when we look around our table tonight, when we're looking at diversity of arts in Ireland, there is actually lots of missing pieces of that jigsaw puzzle. And that work is being done. But you know, how do we really integrate all of that? How do we create those kind of models? And so within IAmIrish, you know, we've looked at theatre and in the broadest sense of, you know, what is theatre, and when we're looking at creativity and the link between audience and player and how all of that works, and going back to what's professional and what's not professional. And I think, you know, currently in the residency at the Access in Ballymun, I'm really looking at how we can contextualize without stigmatizing, because often there is this different scene between what is professional theatre and who can access professional theatre, who can be in professional theatre, who can make professional theatre, who's going to fund professional theatre, which all of these layers again creates exclusion. So in the work that I've been doing, I've been trying to strip away all of those things, and actually even, you know, looking at diverse funding models, looking at how we're reaching new audiences, where we're taking the work, who are the players, who's given the responsibility, who's well, I guess it's about just really being transparent at every single level of what we're doing. And actually, in some ways, that is taking real risk and being able to experiment in lots of ways and making everybody responsible and giving everybody ownership over whatever is created.
Those are very powerful points, Lorraine, and it's terrific to hear them. I think a lot of people, it will resonate with a lot of people that you, as an Irish person, feel excluded from an Irish art scene, indeed feel it more hospitable to work in London than you do here. And I mean, teasing out all those layers by which exclusions can happen, and to emphasize that notion of professionalism in the way that you have. Again, do we need to have that strict emphasis on what is professional and what is amateur? and who do we approach, or who do we promote when it comes to the making of art? I'm going to come to you, Pamela, at this point as well. You've had a very particular vantage point in being a receiving house, in effect, for the emerging artist at the New Theatre. I can imagine, and I know this is wrong, but I can imagine that you need only sit there and wait for place to come in, and they will, and decide which of those plays deserves a platform and which doesn't. And yet, if we're to diversify, we need to be proactive. We need to seek out those voices. We need invariably to give skills to people in order for their voices to be part of theatre culture, as it were. Perhaps you can give us a little bit of an insight into that side of things on your part, how it is you work with the emerging artists and who it is you work with.
Sure. Well, I suppose in relation to the New Theatre in specific, the New Theatre would always, for many, many years, would have used this word social inclusion. So that it would have had this kind of idea at the heart of it. So that was really sort of probably more based on a socioeconomic level of who's being excluded at that socioeconomic level. So for many years, the North Inner City community groups have come in and worked in theatre for about 10 years or so. And they've also done internships at the theatre, like, informal internships where they've learnt how a theatre functions, how a theatre building functions alongside actually performing some of their work. And there's also been a relationship with members of the travelling acting community. So Michael Collins would have a long-standing relationship with that theatre, and he would have some of his writing would have like come to fruition there as well in the early parts of his career. So, I mean, it's kind of built into the fabric and the DNA of the building. So when I've been working there, my job has been to look at ways to support that and to support those artists. And the key platform for that in the year is the New Writing Week. And that specifically has a call out, has an open call and a call out. And within that call out, it specifically identifies people who might not feel that they should apply, to encourage them to apply. So we look for diverse artists, but we also, everything is kind of anonymous, and it's, goes through a system of readers, and then you end up with a short list of work. And within that reading panel and the rubric they're given, it is to look for diverse narratives within the work as well, actively, do you know? So that's the kind of active platform there. And then within that program, it shifted a couple of years ago when I went in to expand around, to create more than the reading around it, so that you can develop a network, a professional network, through the directors and the actors that we hire, who are all of a very high standard and a high level of experience with new work. And then that allows you access to a network of professional theatre makers that you might not have had before. And then also I do a set of work with them about what it is to draft and redraft your play and the critical reflexive tools that you'll need to do that. So it's a very short version of what a long-term development would be, but it gives you a kind of introduction to what that is, should you get to the point of having a relationship with a theatre or being commissioned by an organisation, etc. So there's kind of a set of skills built there, hopefully, around their involvement with theatre. And then the lovely thing about it is that it's very often one of the earliest points that artist will have had an audience in to see a full-length play of their work. So you kind of forget when you're making plays a lot, the sheer white-knuckle terror of that moment, the first time you put your first big piece of theatre out there. So it's a very kind of safe environment for emergent artists to do that within, so I mean, that's the work with the New Theatre. The other set of artists that I'd work with quite regularly are through the Arts Disability Ireland programme of funding. So that's a structure of mentorship, and there's different awards you can apply for, which is training or mentorship. And then more recently, Arts Disability Ireland have created the Realise Award to bring a piece of art, and in this case, in the first year, it was a piece of theatre, to the stage. So they have a really interesting and I won't take up the whole evening talking about this, but they have a really interesting approach to things like, for example, funding. When you go to fill out a funding application, you don't have to do it yourself. You can nominate somebody else to do it for you, because the people applying to that might have issues around learning difficulties with language. They might have complexities with working with written forms. So you can also submit like verbal and film pieces in terms of your application. Arts Disability Ireland will also then review your application for you when you can submit a draft version to them. So they will assist you in the editing and the formulating of, I suppose, art speak language that is necessary for funding forms, which is a particular skill set, I would say, in terms of being an artist and negotiating production and funding and so forth. And then what they're looking for specifically in their funding is also to support the artist. So this idea of mentorship, where when I would work with people, it's about kind of upskilling and across in different areas. It might be specifically about playwriting, but it might also be about moving into a different area, a different aesthetic form, a different artist seeking to find a form for their artistic voice. So it might be about research and exploration. And then again, there's also this element about how do you navigate the industry? You know, so whether it's like, that might be funding, it might be residencies, it might be the ethos of venues and arts organizations. You know, it's having those conversations with people that hopefully sort of start opening doors for them, or at least indicate the doors they want to start banging on, you know?
Right then, I might, at that point, I'd like to invite anyone to come in response to some of the prompts or questions I'll start to put to you as a panel. The first is that each of you are in positions of leadership of one kind or another, and I just want to know how important is it in your own evolution and in the evolution of the organizations in which you are in charge that it diversifies, and how will you gauge the amount of diversification that takes place? What do you understand by diversifying in that sense? How will you get a feedback on your own leadership on the question of diversity? Would any of you like to jump in on that point? Who do you think needs to tell you how well you're doing? Do you get that information from your funders? Do you get that from your audience? Do you get that from the people you're working with? Do you get that from the people who are knocking on your door who may not manage to get through, for instance?
I'll just
Lorraine, go ahead. Yes.
Just to respond to that, Thomas, I mean, we exist purely to work in a diverse way with diverse narratives, and that's purely at the heart of everything that we do. But the company itself, I guess, came out of a response to those that were at the heart of it, and that's the people that we represent. It's the stories that we're telling, and they're the people that tell us whether we're doing a good job. And I think that the audiences that we even set out to attract happen to be, you know, we attracted a much wider audience because the stories that we're telling reflect far beyond what we initially set out to do, or even, you know, when we think about our mission, we know that the stories that are coming from the work that we're creating is speaking to everybody, because there's something really, really kind of basic in terms of, you know, humanity at the crux of everything that we do that speaks to everybody. And so even when we're thinking about the output, because I've decided from the beginning, we're never going to be driven by funding. If the money is not there, we're just going to do it anyway, and everything else will come. If we create good work, we're speaking to the right people, we're telling the right stories, and we're including everybody within those stories, everything else will follow. And so said, so done. You know, that's in lots of ways what's happened. But I think that there's something greater about how the organization is placed within the sector, outside of what we go out of our way to do, just thinking across the sector about how the sector looks, and the sector being responsive to the whole community, to really looking at representation in the real essence of everything that it does, but also thinking about what different, we're looking at some of the institutions that we see, their remit exists for a very specific reason. And so, we also need to be really kind of mindful about that. If you're looking at a really classically led organization, we wouldn't be asking that organization to work outside of their remits. And I think that we need to have some kind of real and transparent conversations about that.
Terrific. I might ask Selina then as well. I'm just wondering that you are very aware of a number of tensions within which you work. Somebody from the outside taking on an institution that has so much of a kind of a rooted identity within the city. I wonder what kind of balance you have struck between listening and promoting that sense of continuity, and then trying to ask that to shift in some way, to take on challenges, to take on something new, to invite a new sense of itself for the organization, and what kinds of listening and what kinds of conversations you had to have in order to try and to get it to shift and to change.
That's a really good question. So I think back in 2017, I was really firstly speaking to artists just around what their idea is of the Gate and what it could be, and what are the stories we should be telling. Each week I try and keep something in my diary for an open call that people can come, and whoever it is, wherever they are, and wherever they're from, to come and have a conversation around ideas, stories, advice, whatever it is, in order to try and open up a bit more. Maybe, one thing I really want to try and break down are those barriers around, oh, you run this cultural institution and we can't get to you. So I think that was a really key sort of for me, to try and open up different artists coming in with their different stories to try and have a conversation. And then mostly it's to do with a dialogue and creating creative partnerships with as many artists from as many diverse backgrounds as you possibly can. One of the key indicators for me, you were talking about, just in terms of, I don't like quotas, but since 2017, the Gate has, one of the big things for me at the time was gender equality across, and bringing women in to tell their stories at the Gate. And I think that was a real, we since 2017, we've done 61% increase in female artists at the Gate, which was a huge achievement, which I feel, and still is, a huge achievement. I think we've still got a long way to go, and in many other diverse areas of what the Gate is currently doing, or what it needs to be doing. And then new audiences would be another key piece of seeing new audiences who've never been or stepped foot into the Gate coming to see work. And that again is a huge, in terms of success, I suppose, seeing new audiences come in is it's hugely satisfying to think that new work is being played to whole new audiences out there. Who might have never even thought the Gate exist, who never even knew where the Gate was, Yeah.
And the Gate has certainly an imprimatur whereby if you find yourself working there, you've kind of made it as a professional. You can feel yourself to be a professional. Do you feel that as a responsibility, and does that inhibit you to cast the net as wide as you might like to?
In terms of artist employment, in terms of stories, do you mean? Or do you mean
the stories of the artists, the people who are on the stage, the people who are working within the organisation?
I think it's a really interesting question. So, there's nothing lonelier than being alone in the Gate library, staring at dead men's plays on the walls, where it's a classical institution where the DNA of the Gate is the classics. And one of the key sort of challenges was, how are we going to reimagine those stories for today? Because that is a pillar of the Gates mission and program, and has been since 1928, where these classics are told, and they're brilliant and they're timeless. But what's the mechanism, I suppose, or how do we as in the arts ecology in Ireland and the world, try and break open these stories and to make them feel relevant for our world today, for new audiences today? And there's many ways you can do that, but it is a big journey to go on. It's not the only element that the Gate does in terms of programming, but it is one of the key elements, and still remains so. So yeah.
I'm going to come to Mary Moynihan then. Mary, I wonder if you might reflect on developments at the Arts Council. The Arts Council have produced a policy document, the Equality, Human Rights and Diversity document, or policy. And I just want to know, do you think that's the Arts Council being very belated in approaching this, or indeed do you find in any that you are inspired in any way by what you see in that document, what are now key aspects to the endeavours of the Arts Council?
I actually did a review of the document when it came out,
right.
And I found it a really fascinating exercise, because it made me even start to think about things I hadn't previously thought about on many different levels. I think, first of all, it is important to say that it's brilliant they have that document. And I think they have to be commended for that, to actually have a policy document related to the arts that is linked directly to equality and diversity and to human rights. So I think those three areas are very important. And what I found about their policy was there is some really good things in it. You know, they talk about research, they talk about consultancy, they talk about representation. But the two flaws I would see, or the two things I really need to look at, is that, first of all, representation is not enough when it comes to power, when it comes to inclusion, that you have to look at the power structures that are in play, and you have to talk about changing the power structures. And we haven't, how do we begin to have those conversations? A lot of the time the power structures are invisible, we can't see them. You know, theatre is about making the invisible visible, but it's not enough to have representation of women. Where's class in that? Where's the different, you know, we really have to broaden it out. Where are the different diversities within that? And you're not going to change, you're not going to have fundamental change unless you have structural change. So that's talking on a very radical level, and that needs to happen. And the second thing I would say that I would encourage the likes of the Arts Council and other organisations to do is that they take too long. They talk about doing things. They've been talking a lot about change, but they really need to start looking at how do you make immediate change rather than talking about change and rather than talking about consultation. And the second thing I would say around consultation is that, to me, there should be something in that says, we will consult, but we must abide by what we're told or what we hear in the consultation. I think that's really important as well. But I do think it's great it's there. There's some brilliant things in it. It's really worth reading and looking at. It just needs to go further. The whole class thing is a big thing in England. I only just, you know, in terms of, basically it's getting to a stage where unless you have alternative sources of income or you come from wealth, it's very hard to actually have a career in the arts. It's the same here. Those things need to be looked at. So there's just those areas that they need to go much further on. But the journey has started, and that's important.
Just to tease it out a little further, one of the things they don't have is teeth. And it's often the case that the Arts Council is not actually ever flexing its real muscle insofar as it has the money and it's distributing that. But there are no provisions for expecting companies to abide by the commitments they make on the question of diversity. There are no penalties that companies face, it seems. And indeed, you, as you point out, a lot of the targets require 2-3 years and more to bed in before the Arts Council acknowledge that these are changes that will take place. So it's a document that is really looking for diversity to take place without any real structural change behind it.
Yeah.
And in some ways, people may be complacent enough to think we can continue to do what we have always done. We just may shuffle the people around the table a little bit. So there is a little bit more to do. And should
There's
the pressure...
a lot more to do.
A lot more to do. I wonder where the pressure could come from in order to tell the Arts Council that very thing, and not to be complacent. Dijana, I might come to you. You have now begun diverting a great many of your energies in that to the training of artists. Could you tell us a little bit about that, and about who gets to train, how they make the journey to you, how you help them in the journey to actually availing of that training, and what happens to them over the span of that training, and indeed, where do they go after that?
Yes, I would just like to thank you. I would like also to add something to what to the previous, let's say, talks, and what Mary said about structural change, because we are having these days in my country huge official debate how we need to change the gender quote, and how for the first time in our history we are going to have 61% of females in the parliament, and so on and so on, while
61%?
basically 61%, yes, of women in the parliament. So this is what is the goal of the new government and so on. But we are speaking about the government that is very right-wing oriented, that is very authoritarian. Even we can speak about very soft dictatorship. So the problem is that there is the change in the structure. So European Union is asking Serbia to make quotes and gender quote again, and this is what Serbia is delivering. But basically there is the huge abuse of the human rights. There are no media freedoms. We had recently attack and tearing the works of the artists that created the comics on a very tough topics, including the drawings of the babies with arms and so on. So it was the breaking into the gallery, and the guys destroyed the works, and our Ministry of Culture basically said, but the work was depicting too dark topics, for example, and so on and so on. We have the prime minister that is the woman, openly lesbian, that at the beginning we thought, oh wow, this is really amazing, speaking about diversity, but in reality she is just obedient, I can say, soldier of the ruling party, who did nothing for the LGBT rights, and we are witnessing the homophobic crimes every day, I mean, in our country. And she didn't support the same-sex marriages, possibility for them to adopt children, and so on, while she's having with her partner a child. And so this is so I think it's very important to speak, what does it really mean when we say there is the change, and what are the structural changes, and what is the change of the mindset of the people. And then I could come to arts and education, necessity of education and art, so that we can really move this mountain of the problems. Speaking about the training, I'm coming from the very traditional theater background that I left completely. And as Mary said in the previous conversation we had just before opening for the audience, we consciously chose to work outside of institution and outside of the traditional or state governed and structured institutions, and especially educational institutions. So in a way we chose to be on the margins of the society in some way. But then we can debate what is the margin, what is the center, and how we move. And we have this ability basically really to move from one to another. And so we are we just offered the different trainings, and summer school of dark theater programs, inside of the laboratory, various workshops with us, and with inviting guests and artists. And because we wanted to offer something different. When we started in the beginning of 90s, it was no notion what was the workshop. I mean, really, people thought that the workshop is the place where someone comes with the nails and hammer and start to work around something, you know, and like, what is the theater workshop? What are you speaking about? So we had to introduce and to change a lot, and we managed, and now there is the whole scene, luckily, art scene, very strong independent art scene doing it. And so we are contributing also to with offering these different programs, and people really find us. I mean, we are traveling a lot internationally, at least before the times of COVID, and nationally, and people start to really like and appreciate the work, and this is how they find us. So it's not that we are targeting people, but we are opening the possibilities for everyone who would approach us to join to any of the programs or training programs we have.
Terrific. It's a very big conversation and one I'm passionate about, like how you alert people from marginal demographic backgrounds to the kinds of opportunities that you provide, Dijana, and indeed you all provide in your respective spheres, but how you make young people to aspire to the things that you do, and indeed you are passionate about yourselves. I'm going to come to Pamela, and we'll close on this and then start to open it to questions from anybody who's looking in from on the discussion. But Pamela, I just wanted to ask you about the times in which we find ourselves. You know, it's impossible to forget what conditions prevail and indeed the fact that these conditions prevail means that we're here online. One eminent Dublin actor was heard saying recently that asking if theatre was going to be lost down a laptop. But do you get the sense that people are in actual fact thinking big at this time and retooling and rethinking their aspirations and what they can do, and rethinking those aspirations along diversity lines? And indeed, that Black Lives Matter movement has in actual fact touched everybody and chemically realigned them and got them to think about these things.
Yeah, it's a strange moment, isn't it? Because everything is kind of broken wide open. But yet at the same time, you're looking at artists who are under tremendous pressure, you know, financial, emotional, psychological. So, yeah, I think everyone's come through the shock moment, if you like. And now the conversation is becoming, where do you go from here? And how do you sustain the theatre? How do you sustain the presentation of work? And I think also what's happening is people are realizing that maybe for a little while, the focus isn't on presentation. It's actually on what it can be to develop artists, for artists themselves to develop skill sets, but also to develop work, new work. And I suppose this is where the opportunity for diversity to be embedded comes right into it. I don't know how widely people are discussing it, but I do know that, like, I'm working with 2 venues on their plans for 21, the strategic funding applications that everyone's wrestling with at the moment. And one of those is the development of new plays by Black theatre artists, and another one is looking at female voices, but specifically 50+ female voices, you know, and that maybe there's more those ideas are being received better at the moment. But the interesting part of the conversation for me is the bit that you talked about. How do you alert people to these possibilities? And I was working with somebody, Lucy Ryan actually had been on part of the Waking the Feminists. And one of the learnings from that is that actually you get on the phone and you start calling people and you don't wait for them to come to you. You know, you are proactive and you engage and you get out of, as a programmer or a dramaturg or whoever you are, you get out of your own comfort zone and you go to places that you don't normally go to find the people that you wouldn't normally necessarily be on the radar. And one of the great things at the moment is we all have that little bit of extra time to actually do that, you know. Yeah, but I also wanted to loop back to something that you said about evaluation and how do you create an evaluation of this work, you know. And I mean, for me, because I work directly with the artists themselves, the most important piece of evaluation for me is never a funder. It's actually the artist, and can they actually point to what has been beneficial about a process or a program, be that career-wise or in the piece of work that was created. But then also, I think something that I've done since Waking the Feminists is like I evaluate my own work along with the tax return every year. Who have you worked with this year? So, you know, the slate of artists that you've worked with, do the actual breakdown of all those things. Where have they come from? Geographically, socioeconomically, ethnicity, gender. Make your own count. And sometimes what I uncover is my unconscious bias, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So recently I was like, oh, it's fine. I've worked with disabled artists. Only it turned out I hadn't worked with any female disabled artists. I'd only worked with male disabled artists. So that was up to me to change that then, you know?
Terrific. That's a really brilliant piece of advice. We're coming up to a point where we will take a break, but just before we do that, in addition to inviting our audience to ask us questions, and we'll hopefully have questions to sort through and to put to you all, but you may indeed have questions to put to each other. You've been listening to each other. I know that in your positions of leadership, you all espouse the value of listening. You're all very powerful listeners. So if you'd like to talk amongst yourself in public, as you would be doing, please think about that as well and reflect on what kind of questions you might want to ask each other and what more you'd like to know from each other. In that case, then, we are now at 8 minutes past 8, and maybe if we are back talking to each other by 1:15 and no later, and we'll take another half hour after that. Thank you thus far, all the panelists.
Okay. Followers know. If you're watching on Facebook, hit that follow button and give us a like. Take a moment to share this live feed with your friends and followers right now. If you're watching us on YouTube, make sure to give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and click that bell to keep updated on our new and exclusive YouTube content. Creating live content is a costly endeavour. If you'd like to help us keep the conversations going, please hop on over to our Patreon page, where you could become a patron and gain access to exclusive patron-only content. Patreon.com/TheatreMaker.ie. You can find us on most social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and YouTube at TheatreMaker.ie. Catch additional news, blogs, and sector coverage on our website, TheatreMaker.ie. Watch this space. There's more exciting content on the way from TheatreMaker.ie.
we are back. It's lovely to be able to say that. And indeed, we have some questions from those of you listening in. And I look forward to putting these questions to the panelists. I'm going to start, and I'll just leave them out there for any panelist to respond to. And if you want to indicate that you want to respond, please just give a nod, and I'll ask you to. A question is about representation and weighing the balance between representation on stage and indeed off stage. That those we see on stage may not reflect the fact that the organization itself is diverse in all its aspects. So, you know, we know that we need representation on boards. We know that we need them within the wider pool of staff within an organization. We know that they need to be part of the creative thinking in that organization and very much plugged into that, as much as contributing the stories and being the communicators or the mediators of those stories. How do we keep an eye on each of those various layers, as Lorraine referred to them earlier? How do we strike that balance? And I would ask maybe even further, in terms of an Irish narrative around diversity, like we move from a homogenous society into a multicultural society in a relatively short space of time. And some of the early work around diversity was really about how communities were being accommodated or integrating into this homogenous Irish bloc. That doesn't work anymore, I don't think. So, like, what kinds of stories do we need to tell? Have we yet to tell? And how do we enable people to tell them? Robert Farhat has written a very powerful blog post on this, and I'm sure you're familiar with it, where he says, just get out of the way. Let people of color, let people from marginal backgrounds take over the reins of control. Let them take over the organizations. Let them be the ones to decide what it is that gets put on. Lorraine, you're nodding your head vigorously here.
I've had these conversations at length with Rob, but equally, I'm smiling here, Thomas, even listening to what you're saying, because I think one of the first things we need to do is to change the narrative that actually we've just become a multicultural organization. Like, I've been around for a very, very, very long time, and so have other people like me. You know, Ireland has not just become a multicultural society. The stories and the narratives about Ireland globally have been of an homogenous white society, but that's not who we are. And that's why, you know, so many people have left Ireland, because Ireland consistently excludes us from those conversations. And here we find ourselves in 2020, after, you know, a global outpouring of rage around the Black Lives Matter movement, and people now, you know, how can we suddenly now be thinking like something exists now that didn't exist the month before? Like, this is what that we should all this is what we should all have always been doing. And when we're thinking about our audiences and who's on stage, we should all be the same people. We're all part of the same community. And when we're looking at our organizations, if within our organizations we're not reflective of the community that we serve, the taxpayers who are funding our work, you know, because let's face it, anyone that's getting funding from you know, governmental funding, Arts Council funding, it's coming from taxpayers. So our work should always be representative. And that means the people that are making the work, the people that are deciding what work that we're seeing, the audiences, and all of this work is, you know, consistently. This should be part of what we talk about every week, not something that we just, you know, that we think about when we've got a report to write. We should be thinking about all of these narratives all of the time, and thinking about who we are as Irish theatre makers. Who are we? What is the story that we're telling? Because there are some very complex nuances specific to Ireland.
Yes. Could I come then both to Dijana and to Selina and then to Mary? Just very quickly, I get a sense that this notion of community is very, very important for you, for the three of you in the work that you do, and indeed Pamela as well in the New Theatre. But how do you define that? How important is it for the gate to realise that here it is in in actual fact, in North Inner City Dublin, in amongst communities that are actually quite poor. How aware are you of that in your own decision making? We got some evidence of that being part of your work with your collaborations with Anu and Louise Lowe, but how much further might that go, that you're embedded in a North Inner City community in the way that, say, the Young Vic is embedded in its community in the South Side of London?
Absolutely. So one of the key, what COVID has really brought up for us is a time to really embed ourselves in the community, in the local community. I think what has exposed the Gate in terms of our reliance on that box office that no longer is there, it exposed us so dramatically that the organizations, I think, and the companies who were more robust during COVID were always those companies and institutions that had networks and ecosystems in the community. And I think one of the learnings that I've taken away and I've been sort of slowly building has been, we need to completely, next year is going to be a real bridge year for the Gate, is to work with companies, continue to work with companies like Anu. But one of the ideas we are currently looking at is to open the whole space up to communities. I know David Jubb wrote a really interesting blog around very much what would that new theatre be like if you gave it over, gave our spaces over, and to ask, ask the communities and ask those players and makers in the community and people that maybe never even thought about what the Gate is and doesn't even know where it is, who live in D1. What are the stories we should be telling, and engaging directly with youth, with young people, with education, with health partners, to try and really look at those stories for the future. And that's something the Gate has never had the opportunity to do. And I think it has been the hierarchical nature of being funded to produce work to reach as many audiences that we possibly can, and never having the time to actually, and just to deliver 82% box office in order to keep the whole thing turning, to actually go, now, wait a sec, this is a time for us to completely rethink and reimagine and rebuild what the role and the purpose, and that was, I was sort of saying at the beginning, what the role and purpose of the Gate could be next year, to try and really see, in terms of diversity, in terms of audiences, in terms of makers, in terms of stories we could be telling in the future.
Yeah,
what is your community? What is the community that you define in relation to that theatre company?
We are coming from very different situation than, of course, let's say the situation of Gate Theatre or Ireland, because we are nomads ourselves. We don't have the venue, and we are moving from space to space. And I mean, this is, of course, the reflection of the situation and our political views and choices, of course. But then we are actually constantly the part of that community, because we perform on the streets, we perform in the buses, we perform in the site-specific places, or do different projects on the squares of the cities and so on. And this is how Ireland, we feel that we are breathing together with the community. So in that sense, I can say that even there is a certain advantage of not having the venue. I mean, of course, having the venue is completely other thing, and from time to time we had these situations, but I can say that now it is like coming really to the people and being the part of the people. So they simply share with us, we are one of them. So it's not the question of being in kind of the privileged exclusive position with the space.
Terrific. Mary, I suppose one of the things you may encounter in your work is how strong community identity is in various parts of Ireland, and particularly in marginal communities in some ways, and that working in marginal communities can be a very satisfying experience. Would that be the case?
Yes, well, I actually have to say that in terms of my own personal growth and in terms of my art, that I have learned so much from working with different communities. And what I learned early on was the importance of not, as Diana was saying, you know, you have to be really careful about how you approach the work, because you are not giving anybody a voice. They already have a voice. You are not the expert coming in to teach everybody what you know. It really is like what Paolo Freire says. I go in to work with the community and they are the experts and I am the expert, and we share the expertise with each other. And I think when it comes to communities, like for example, you know, there's communities of place and communities of interest, and I've worked with both. And I think you have to be careful with this idea of helicoptering in and coming back out, that you have to, if you're going to go into a community, in a way, you have to find a way to embed yourself in that community, and you have to get to know that community. You have to build trust with that community. You know, we found that particularly when we were in Northern Ireland, we come across gatekeepers. The idea of trust has to be built up. And then for me, working with communities, it became very much about, I don't make art for other people. I can make my own art. And is it artist led? Is it community led? Who has ownership over the work? And the idea of empowerment. And in a way, Smashing Times, at a certain point, we started training communities because we wanted to pass on the skills. And like, for example, we set up the first drama facilitation program in Ireland at a university level. We set that up. And at a certain point, we said, look, we need to go back now and keep making art. And hopefully somebody will mainstream this. And it was never mainstreamed. So the idea of passing on the skills to communities in different levels is really important.
Great. We'll come to the next question. And Pamela, I'm going to ask you this question. And it is something that Lorraine has in fact pointed out to us, the need to make space. What kinds of adjustments must there be made within the industry in order to make space? And indeed, those adjustments down to the ways in which we ask artists to apply the actual forms by which they apply for funding. Do they come down to the relationships in which organizations are embedded? Do they come down to the means by which they communicate with audiences and bring audiences into the artistic circle, as it were? But any thoughts on how we might make the changes that allow people to recognize diversity happening at all levels, to make it easier?
To make it easier to happen within an organization. Yeah. I mean, first of all, you have to sound like some of the things are really simple about it. Like everyone has to be on the same page. So in my opinion, and this is having probably more so worked with different organizations, both grassroots and in-house traditional theatre venues in the UK, a top-down approach doesn't work. It doesn't work for one person in management to say, right, you know, we now have to focus on this area. You know, you have to have the entire building and the staff on board with you. Because the other thing you're talking about, and I think actually it probably doesn't matter where the person is coming from, but if you are from a marginalized background, you have to resource that artist to be able to create the work. And you have to assume as well, you have to remember that the language that we use is a jargon language. We have an internalized business language. You know, even how we talk about the process and the tech and the speed that we work out as well, because we've built in assumed knowledges, and that's how we work with 4 weeks rehearsals. Do you know what I mean? So like I find the work that I do with artists of diversity really rewarding, because I have to change my practice. And in having to change my practice, I have to question what I do and why I'm doing it, and not just fall back on the same things over and over again. Because it's really, and again, it's a lot of it is really simple stuff. Like Roderick Ford is a neurodiverse artist that I was working with. And so there's certain things that he can do and there's certain things that he can't do. And that's in a rehearsal room, that's in everything. The length of a meeting, it's in the sensory overload at the opening night. You know, there's so many different aspects. And all it requires really is a continuing dialogue with that person or with the group involved, as the case may be, and actually making continual adjustments as you're going. And often those are small, easy to achieve adjustments. But you have to be constantly in that dialogue as the process continues, and never assuming that it just kind of automatically happens because we said we were going to do it, you know, in a management meeting kind of one day, you know? So yeah, it's kind of a consciousness of how you practice. What are the requirements within this practice for a community, for an artist? And then sort of the notion of evaluation is not an abstract one. It's something that you're continually doing as you move through the project. Is it working? Has this been a bad day? Why was it a bad day? And like, I mean, and I think other people could speak to this here as well. Think about what's in the room. Do you know, if you're working with a community who have survived the troubles of the war, you know, you got to be conscious that there's going to be an element of PTSD in that room. Do you know, like what is in that room with you that you're also working with? Because there'll be reasons why things won't work on certain days, you know, but then also that will also be on another day a reason why the whole creative process bursts on fire for you, you know?
Sure. That does point to the third question then, that the importance of consistently reviewing your own position in order to know how it is impacting in terms of the aspirations you set out for yourself and for the organization you lead. Could I ask you, have you, any of you, techniques you might share when it comes to self-critique, or how important it features? Where do you find the space in which to sit down and reflect on how well you've done or how things might have gone? What kind of spaces do you create? Are those spaces you create through writing? Are they spaces you create through dialogue with key advisors or, you know, key intimates? Are they spaces you create simply in some kind of dialogue you have with yourself? What are the ways in which you self-critique? And how does that manifest as being open to change and available to making adjustments? Would anyone like to jump in on that? What are the techniques for self-critiquing? What do you rely on to tell you how well the organization is doing? Do you rely on your board to do that?
I might answer that then.
Mary, yeah. All the above.
Yeah, you mentioned all of that, you know, a list of things earlier, and we do try, for example, you know, to get, you know, the board to give us feedback. Every project we do, we use evaluation forms. We try as much as we can to keep the dialogue open. We would do the same amongst ourselves. The whole idea, like Pamela was talking about, like self-evaluation, all of that's really important to just keep dialogue going. And because of the funders as well too, we have to do formal evaluations around the work, and sometimes you have to bring in independent evaluation, which is really great when you can do that, because there's an outside eye then looking at the whole work and they see things you don't see. What I would say though is, as an artist working in a company where core funding is an issue, we often come across this issue of you're so busy making the work and then doing your funding applications to raise the funding for the work, that you would love to have the time to take space out and have that time for self-reflection as much as you can. I think what's happening at the moment, one of the positives, if you can say there's any positives for the pandemic, is that it is giving us more time to reflect and to engage with each other and to talk with each other. So that is a positive. And I would say too, that when it comes to evaluation, do all the formal evaluations, and I think they're very important, but I think also too, trust your own instincts as well. For me, that's important. I remember very early on, it's just a small little story that happened to us very early on, where I think it was the Arts Council, where we were asked to do an evaluation day, and an independent evaluation was brought in. They evaluated our work. They said everything was brilliant. They loved the way we worked. They loved everything that was going on. But they actually turned around and said, we want you to change your structure, the structure of the company. And I remember we sat down and we really thought hard about this. And we said, we can't do that, because our structure at that time was a collaborative structure. It wasn't a hierarchical structure. It was a structure that was probably slightly different in terms of how we were making the work. We work very much as a collaborative organisation. So we're all sharing ideas and working on an equal level, if you like, or we try to do that. And we said, we're not going to do that because we could lose what's actually working for us. So it's trusting your instinct about what works for you, as well as looking at the outside eye to come in and tell you what you need to do. And I do think then, as Pamela said, to constantly question and critique is really important.
How do you know what experience your audience is having? How do you know what audience members are there and what audience members aren't there? And sorry, Lorraine, yes, go ahead if you'd like to jump in as well.
Well, I just wanted to add to what Mary said, that within my practice and within the organisations that I work with, we have consistent reflective practice, and I think we work in a trauma-informed way. So we have clinical supervision, and we ensure that we have check-ins and debriefs from every single session that takes place, and weekly, monthly, and seasonally. That we're continually to have reflective spaces with all stakeholders, and I think that it's really important, particularly when you're working, intersectionally, and when you're working with communities who've been oppressed. So that's just to speak to the first question.
And indeed, I'll follow up with Dijana. Dijana, you mentioned how your work actually chooses to investigate the wounds that a society might hold. In that regard, it's very important to keep a certain kind of dialogue going with all the participants, and to know where they are in that regard. How important, again, are there for you to have evaluation techniques or reflective techniques in order to make sure people are being supported through the work, even when it touches on emotionally challenging areas?
We also have a lot of evaluation techniques that are more or less, known as evaluation techniques that we do. But what I really value is the meetings with the audiences or with the members of community, and really creating this space for talking and very often and reflection, and or ask them to write us and so on. So very often after the shows or after the works, we invite the audience to stay for a long time. When we had the venue for some time, we were really offering like a glass of wine or water for free, and we were just really like staying with people, and it was incredible how much it was valued, because we had an ongoing debate, like, is that economically clever? So we are investing in and some of us were, and I think we were right, like it was worth doing it and creating this kind of the atmosphere that people would really feel like at home. But also I think that this is precious to understand that we need the time for reflection, and this is what we all underestimate. And I think speaking to funders and thinking about funders, somehow we need to communicate that. And this is because we run from projects to project, and this could be really debilitating in many ways.
Yes. I just want to ask you again about that notion of audiences. Selina, I might ask you, you mentioned that you noticed a new audience coming in during your tenure, but I'm curious to know how you knew that. And
you're there every night seeing them, or you're there watching. Right. I think that's a really great way to just be around as much as you can at night and at matinees, and speaking to people and asking and sitting next to someone and saying, have you been to the gate before? No, or you have, or you haven't, or what do they think? I would like to just say something about the self-critique thing as well, because I was just wanted to say that I think what I find really helpful is journal writing when you have time, is to have that dialogue with yourself, but also mentors, I think, are really, really key, of people who have experienced similar challenges or processes, both artistically, creatively, but also managerial, and sort of trying to figure out and navigate your way through, which can be really, really challenging at times, to try and balance at all times, to try your best, to try and be open and to be transparent and to be as inclusive as you possibly can.
And again, would all of you put yourself in the position to be a mentor, and indeed a mentor for somebody from a marginal community? I mean, how much work would it involve for you to mentor somebody from those very backgrounds that you want to support? and recognise that they need support. Have any of you taken on that responsibility? Yes, Lorraine.
I mean, it's essential to me that we, that we do that. I'm a real fan of grow your own. I would consider myself a non-traditional artist. I didn't go to theatre school. I didn't, I barely left Ireland with qualifications. I educated as time went on, but also that, I'm thinking about these ideas of mainstream and excellence and who creates all of this. So it's really important to me that everything I do is about creating space and ensuring that I'm bringing people along. And I often say, we need all of us should really, and going back to your first questions around responsibility, we have a responsibility to open that door. And sometimes that means going through the door with somebody, pulling out the chair, and in fact, sometimes giving someone your chair. And I think, each one teach one. We have to bring people along with us.
Yeah, I'm going to finish on that note, and I'd just like to say that I find the notion that I found the theme of partnership, creative partnerships, is something that came up quite a lot from all of you in one form or another this evening, and I find it quite exciting to think that there may be partnerships among the 6 of you here that are waiting to take place, and that in a partnership it's a question of not knowing what will emerge, but being open to the possibilities. And I think there are enormous possibilities among yourselves just here tonight. Thank you for contributing so openly and so cogently and so intelligently and so heartfully to the discussion. I hope that it'll stimulate other people to think about their own practice and their own responsibilities and the ways in which they can engage with you in your execution of your responsibilities. And at this point, I'd just like to make some just closing notes on the TheatreMaker.ie website and what we can, what ways in which you as an audience can engage with theatre makers here in Ireland. So, and indeed, just to say thank you to a number of people, those who are very much involved in putting together this festival, the Dublin Arts and Human Rights Festival, particularly Smashing Times and Frontline Defenders, as well as the partners in support. And I need to say that those who organised tonight's event, Kevin Michael Reid and Abigail Grimstead, both graduates of the Lear Academy, have been working tirelessly to make it happen, have been quite brilliant and have been a huge support to me and have got me to be very excited about this evening. And I was delighted to be invited by them to moderate this evening. And finally, I can't say it enough, but thank you to the panelists. Thank you for contributing so well this evening. And I look forward to somehow getting to meet with you again, whether it be online or in person, and continuing the conversation. Okay.
Thanks, Thomas.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Well done. And I hope the conversation stays going amongst you as well, that the circle gets to be closed in some way. Okay, good night all, and good night to our audience.
Followers know. If you're watching on Facebook, hit that follow button and give us a like. Take a moment to share this live feed with your friends and followers right now. If you're watching us on YouTube, make sure to give us a thumbs up, subscribe to our channel, and click that bell to keep updated on our new and exclusive YouTube content. Creating live content is a costly endeavour. If you'd like to help us keep the conversations going, please hop on over to our Patreon page, where you can become a patron and gain access to exclusive patron-only content. patreon.com/TheatreMaker.ie. You can find us on most social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram and YouTube at TheatreMaker.ie. Catch additional news, blogs and sector coverage on our website, TheatreMaker.ie. Watch this space, there's more exciting content on the way from TheatreMaker.ie.